All right, I think we can get started. I'll continue to let folks in as they come in. So just going to begin with some introductions today. I am Kimmy Remus, she, her pronouns, and I am calling in from Susquehannock, Piscataway, and Intego lands. I am a prevention specialist here at the partnership, and I'll be your facilitator today. I'm also going to put in the chat a link or a text if you want to be able to find out which native lands you are on. I'm going to pass it to our presenters so that way they can introduce both of themselves before we actually start the programming. Jonathan, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Jonathan Deros. I currently work as a prevention manager at the Center for Domestic Peace. I am here today because I was in the Marine Corps and I have experience about talking about military, right? So that's essentially who I am.
Okay, and thank you. Thank you for this platform, by the way. This is definitely a good something that needs to be discussed more. My name is Don Waltower. I am a violence prevention advocate. I was not in the Marine Corps, but I happen to work for the Marine Corps, so I will be speaking from that experience. I do not speak for the Marine Corps, but I will just be speaking on my experience as a violence prevention advocate from there, and just in general in civilian world as well.
Wonderful. And kind of on that note, I'm just going to say a little disclaimer for myself as well. Prior to coming to the partnership, I was embedded at the Army Public Health Center, but I am in no way speaking on behalf of the Army or the government. My previous position was called ORISE, which is a post-grad fellowship opportunity. And so I never worked for the Army or the government, and everything that I'm talking about today is information that is easily accessible online, and I can provide all those resources and links.
Can I go ahead and make a disclaimer as well that I don't—
Yes, we can all disclaim.
The organization, the military, or anything like that. I just talk based on my experience and observations and things I've heard from other vets about the military.
Thank you all. That's already a bit of an introduction to the military, is the idea of a couple of disclaimers here and there. I am going to get us started today. Well, I guess we've already started, but I'm going to launch a couple of polls just to get a feel of who is here and what kind of interaction you might have with military and military culture. So there will be 4 questions, and I'm going to launch the first one now. So you should see it on your screen. I don't think it includes co-hosts, so I don't think you will see it, Jonathan or Dominique, but I will share results with everyone.
I can see the question.
You can see, great. Oh, thank you, Annie. Yes, folks, feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. Love to know who is here. Annie says that they're from SAVE in Fremont, housing first manager, but also military mom with both daughters who currently serve. Wonderful. All right, I am going to, because we have almost everyone has answered the surveys, excuse me, the poll. So I'm going to share the results. And can everyone see them on the screen? So it looks like we have about 55% of folks say that either they or anyone in their family has been in the military. About 41% say no. And then we have one person who's unsure. And when I'm saying family, I am using our expanded definition of biological or chosen. So we have kind of about half and half here. I'm going to now launch the second question. And so this question is asking, has anyone ever been to a military installation before? So that could be like Camp Pendleton, Edwards Air Force Base, just kind of as examples. Just wait a second for everyone to participate. Okay, I think we have pretty good saturation. So I am going to share these results now. And again, it's almost an even split. We have 43% of those who answered who say that they have. And then we have about 57 that say that they have not. Okay, so let's go. I have two more. Now I would like to know, are there military personnel or military families in your community? So even if you are not personally connected to the military or have been on any of those operational areas or installations, you might still have folks in your community that are part of that. It's really fun when it's still going and I can see like it go back and forth. Give it another like 10 seconds. Okay, so I'm going to share those results now. So 70% of people say that they do have military personnel and families in their communities. 13 say no, and 17 say they're not sure. And then our last question, why won't it let me launch? Oh, stop sharing. The little clicks you have to do with Zoom. All right, now this one you can select multiple, and it's which of these sources have taught you about the military? And so do you know from personal experience, friends or family, school, media, or if there are any other avenues that people have learned about military and military culture? And if folks feel comfortable putting in the chat. Okay, so let's end that one now. And I'm going to share those results. So this one's a little bit more spread out. So 9 people said they know from personal experience. Then we have, let's see, we have 15 people who say that they know from friends or family. Then we have 10 people say they've learned from school. And we have 43 say that TV or movies is how they learned. I mean, 43%, 10 people, excuse me. And 5 people have said other. And I appreciate Vanessa put in the chat, I worked for DoD for 15 years as a family advocacy program social worker. Oh, Vanessa, perfect. Because I'm definitely going to mention briefly the family advocacy program. So if there are any points where you want to continue to share, feel free. All right. So now that we're kind of done with the polls, thank you for doing that, everyone. And just to kind of say, you know, I do have some military personnel in my family, but haven't been, but they are much upper generations, like the grandparent level, and they don't really talk to me about, or they're deceased now, but hadn't really talked to me about their experiences And I have been on, because I was embedded on a military installation, but I hadn't been on one prior to when I was in my fellowship. There weren't really a lot of military personnel in my community when I was growing up, but now that I live in the DMV, there are so many military personnel in my community now. And so before all of this, and before my experiences in moving to Maryland, I did learn a lot from the media. And also I want to say, Angelica put in the chat, I would say lately, I feel as though I've learned a lot about military culture, through how it is portrayed in the news. Oh, yes, of course. And then that perception is further solidified by members of my family and who are in the military. And so a little bit of background, and thank you everyone for sharing and participating again, is there are 6 service branches over the the Department of Defense, or DoD, just to kind of lay a little bit of groundwork. There's the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, the Air Force, and now the Space Force. And the National Guard Bureau is under the Department of the Army. If anyone is wondering, wait, where's that? That's where that lives. And so what does that look like in the state of California? So we have about 500,000 people who are either active duty, reserve, spouses, or children of military personnel. And that is a number that is not extensive to government civilian employees or contractors. So those who have contact and have direct employment or work relations, et cetera, is going to be a higher number, but I do not have that number. We also have 1.35 million veterans, not including dependents, within the state of California. Those numbers are from 2 years ago, so I don't know if they've gone up or down. And there are 32 military installations and operational areas in California, and that is more than any other state. And so I'm just going to take a second to show on the screen what that looks like. I will also put this link in the chat because this is really not very clear. I will zoom in a little bit. Ooh, I guess I'll zoom in a lot, because you can see just how many installations, how many routes are approved for military training, airspace, etc. And I don't think folks realize or think about it very much. I know I don't. I said growing up, I didn't have a lot of military personnel in my community, but there was an Air Force installation that was pretty close. And so whenever we had like planes fly, we're like, oh, they're going to Hanscom. Like, that's just what we knew. But we didn't really think about how that really impacted the state. And so as you could see there, and I put that link in the chat, huge portions of the state do have some sort of connection. A few other things that I just want to go over a little bit are, in what I know about talking about intimate partner violence within the military, is there some language changes. For example, typically you will hear the words domestic abuse, because domestic violence is a specific charge under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So someone can be charged with domestic violence. So that's why it tends to be referred to as domestic abuse, excuse me. Also, we tend to use the words victims, even though we know that survivor and survivorship is kind of preferred in the DV field in general. Survivor means a different thing in military context. That's someone who survived combat, a veteran, or someone who is a survivor of military sexual trauma. And so domestic abuse, I'm glad Vanessa mentioned the family advocacy program. That's typically where domestic abuse is handled. And that's, safety planning, counseling services, and like reporting services. And you can make a report restricted or unrestricted, which means kind of who you get involved. And it's really hard to get a handle of quite how big of a problem this is. In May 2021, there was a report that said that there were 40,000 domestic abuse incidences involving service members. But we know that in general, those numbers are undercounted in any population. And so, in that also are numbers from several years ago. So that the last numbers that was taken from was 2019, which was prior to all the events of May 2020. And we know how the ongoing pandemic and how inflation and all these factors have driven up some risk factors for folks. So I would anticipate those numbers to be higher. Just a couple of things of what is being done is like there is a policy on integrated primary prevention of self-directed harm and prohibited abuse or harm. And that's pretty new because I've been talking a lot about response right there, right? For a second, you know, okay, this is how we handle it once it's happened. This is the language. But, you know, there's really kind of been a little bit of an effort in recent years to move things a little bit more towards a primary prevention approach and putting resources and valuing that aspect as much as response. And so I will quickly share on the screen. I also put in the chat, section 5.5 is the one that addresses domestic abuse and what that looks like. And so when it says FAP here, that is, or FAP, that is Family Advocacy Program, which I just mentioned. And it shows kind of the different ways, you know, talking about culture change, conflict management skills, good familial relationships, teaching healthy relationships. I'm not going to spend time going through each thing right now, but some of the things that we do talk about in primary prevention work are starting to be kind of integrated into these things. The other thing, so my connection is when I was embedded at the Army Public Health Center, I was collaborating on the preventative plan of action, which was that big shift into primary prevention. And it did primarily look more at sexual assault and sexual harassment. We do know that that's directly tied, you know, to domestic violence and intimate partner violence, you know, when we talk about that in the broader DV field, but it is a separate category. So that's kind of was the sphere that I was in. And that is still an ongoing initiative that looks at, you know, developing a prevention system and supporting it with a comprehensive prevention process. So these are kind of some things that are being done. I know that was very quick. I'm going to put that link in the chat. And for folks that are watching this recording later, these resource links will be attached to our resource library because I don't want to take too much time away from our actual presenters. But I just wanted to give a little bit of background. And the goal for today is really, this is a population, whether intentionally or not, tends to be excluded from typical DV services and agencies. And so we want to be able to educate folks here on some cultural competency and, you know, to show that this is a vulnerable population that our field does need to start engaging with and being more accessible to. So before I pass it off, does anyone have any questions they want to ask or anything additionally they want to share? Okay, nothing heard. And if folks decide that they do want to say anything, just feel free to plop it in the chat. I'm now going to pass it to Jonathan so he can talk a little bit about his experience.
Thank you, Kimmy. So to talk a little bit about my experience, I joined the Marine Corps at the age of 17. I was still in high school, which is kind of interesting because with parental consent, you can be as young as 16 and sign up to go to war before you can even like buy a drink or even register to vote, even vote. So during my time in service, I did 4 years in the United States Marine Corps. Within a month of graduating high school, I was in boot camp. My job was as an artillery cannoneer. Essentially meant I shot the big cannons. Whenever I deployed, I didn't necessarily do my job because of the damage it would create. So we ended up switching to different positions. I did 2 deployments. My first one was in Iraq for about 10 months, where I was as provisional infantry. And I guarded the base, the patrols, and other things. And then my second deployment was aboard a Marine Expeditionary Unit, meaning I was on the Navy carrier and going to multiple countries, and depending on the country, we either trained or got some time off, or completed missions or anything like that. So during my time in service, I really got sucked into the military culture. I am a proud veteran, proud of being serving in the military, but I look back at my experience and see how the culture kind of reinforces violence. And it's not to say the military is intended to go to war. It's intended to win wars, right? And there's a whole, we think about the military now, but it's an institution that has been going on for over 200 years. And so it's really perfected the violence of it. It's really learned to kind of teach us how to glorify it, right? And during my time in service as well, it was before the time of LGBTQ members were allowed to be openly about their sexual orientation, as well as allowing women to be in combat jobs. So I can't really talk about my experience in witnessing that, because everybody in my unit was men. But I can talk about the culture, the violence, and how it can be, how I can see now as a preventionist, as somebody who works in the domestic violence field, how it reinforces and influences domestic violence and dating abuse in relationships, right? So as I said earlier, this institution is a military of culture, right? It's designed in the format because it is intended to win a war, to either be in the front lines of fighting or supporting those who are. So you can be in the military and never actually serve in combat, but you will be somehow supporting combat, whether it's doing the paperwork to people to get paid or sending them, MREs is what you call for food, or actually being in the front lines fighting, right? So I read this really great book called The Psychological Cost of Killing, and it's by a military member who just becomes a psychologist. And he really kind of analyzes how the institution has perfected killing and the cost of it, right? So one example that I really highlights to me is that back in Vietnam era, until recently, people were often drafted. Nowadays, people can actually just volunteer and not have to go if they don't want to. But yet you still technically have to sign up in case there's like a World War III if you're a male and you're 18 years old, right? But before, it was very common for the military to be fully drafted, right? Now, during the Vietnam era, when people trained to go to war, so Vietnam, they used to use targets that kind of look like the symbol of target, the sword, and that's how they were trained to shoot, right? So then what the military found was that when they would go to Vietnam, people still didn't want to kill, they didn't want to shoot. So they missed on purpose, they would shoot high. So what they did was they changed the targets to silhouettes to look at the shape of people. And then they kind of made it into like a psychological game. So if you shoot the target, it would make a sound, it would go down, and it would go back up. And they found that this training exercise made it more efficient for people to actually kill in combat. So that's just an example, one of many that can show how the institution has kind of perfected violence and kind of wanting to kill people, right? Now, in our field, we often talk about how media influences our behaviors or living in a culture that reinforces rape, like rape culture, such as like sexualized content through advertisements or objectification of women in movies, and so on, right? Well, in the military, it's a lot of kill culture, right? It's kill, kill, kill. We sing about it, we glorify it, the violence, the killing, the ultimate form of violence, right? And it's actually, at least in my experience in the military, being a combat job, it's very much honored to be the one to die for your brothers in war, right? It's like the ultimate form of sacrifice. It's viewed as an ultimate form of love, right? So we get a lot of mixed signals there on violence is also connected to love. Like we're doing this for our brothers and sisters that we are with over there, and we're doing this for the people that we are protecting at home, right? Now, There's also very glorified. An example by that I mean is like before we ever had a class in the military, we would always see like a 5-minute motivational video where it's like hardcore rock music, and there was like a bunch of videos of like real live situation, not live, but real situations of like killing terrorists, right? So when this type of culture glorifies violence, it's really desensitized to like like to how something is to something like hitting your partner. It's really kind of minimal and kind of like dismissed and desensitized in the military in general, right? Because of those type of behavior and culture we are in, right? Now understand that the military is intended for that, but the problem is how it's affecting the community, how it's affecting the loved ones of the community, as well as the long-term consequences after being in the community, after serving in the military. Just to show some quick data, it shows that some quick stats, many studies have indicated that in the military, IPV households are much greater than those in civilian households. Some studies indicate that it is higher than in veteran households than in those in active duty, right? There can be many different reasons why this happens. The culture, the high rates of PTSD, drug abuse, general stress of military life, and lack of supportive services can be a reason why IPV occurs, because in the military, it tends to become excluded. Like I said, it doesn't become, like it's not part of the civilian culture. So therefore it's totally different outside community. And because of it, I've often heard people say that the military cannot be, people who are in the military cannot be oppressed, or they cannot be victims and things like that. The only type of form of victim they can be is through like trauma or war, which is not correct necessarily, right? We have a lot of high DV rates, as well as a lot of high sexual assault rates that not just happen between the military member into the partner, but also from the partner into the military member, or even military members to other military members. Excuse me. So yeah, so as well as even active duty military women, among women veteran receive healthcare in the VA between 3 to 7 out of every 10, so 30 to 70% report having experiencing domestic violence at some point. In the active duty woman, more than 3 in every 10, or 36% report having experienced one or more types of IPV during serving in the military. Now, according to a 2018 study, 36% of women and 34% of men experience physical violence, sexual violence, or stalking by an intimate partner in their lifetime. Those numbers go for veterans and services, with some estimates reaching as high as 58%. Again, I mentioned earlier that service members are 3 times more likely to purchase IPV than civilians. Now, there is some new initiatives coming out, right? In 2019, the VA established an intimate partner violence assistance program requiring a designated coordinator at each facility to serve as an expert and consultant for IPV-related issues. Now, however, with all these initiatives, in my observations and experience, talking to others about their experience, not just in the Marine Corps, but other branches as well, I feel like they kind of all have similar experiences regardless. The chain of command doesn't always support the survivor or the victim because of the culture, or because the command doesn't want to get in trouble, right? In many cases, someone can go up to their command, meaning their like manager in civilian terms, and talk about how they're experiencing domestic violence or dating abuse at home, and it's just brushed under the rug because within that household, within that, it's kind of like kept within the house type of environment, meaning that they have to say. And a lot of times they just kind of brush it off because they prefer to have the military member to go to war than to lose him or her into like going to jail, right, or getting kicked out, because that's just going to jail is and catching a misdemeanor is enough to kind of kick the person out of the military service, right? So the command has to choose between losing somebody to go to combat or kicking somebody out of the military. And a lot of times that's just really not the priority. So there is an assumption that either military personnel have all these available resources or that they're not victims. I saw this like in school. I saw this in the military, but also outside in the civilian culture. Like when I was in school, I would talk about my specific. Um, I would help military vets in different organizations, but my master's was specifically focused on veterans who were deported. And I started talking about oppression and intersectionality and those type of topics. And I would hear things like my professor say, um, veterans cannot be oppressed, our military cannot be oppressed. I could see why that is the case because there's a lot of benefits, like you can go to school or you can get a housing. But that doesn't mean that trauma and the same things that civilians are dealing with are not also dealing with in the military community. So it's very important to kind of have these conversations with military personnel, especially because of the fact that you just easily dismissed, or when the person leaves and later on they want to have they want to use this as proof to kind of go against like their partner or something like that in the law. They don't have the evidence to kind of determine that because it's not used. So my recommendation is for anybody who's in the military or who's looking for services to use, to reach out to the military, but also to use civilian resources for that, so that it can be documented and you never know when you might need it in the future as well. I hope that answered everybody's questions and gave some data. I don't know if that was too fast. What do you think, Kimmy?
But thank you for all of that, Jonathan. If folks want to ask questions here, that is perfectly fine. We have time for that. And if not, we can move on to Dominique and we have a formal Q&A towards the end of the webinar. So we'll pause for a moment to see if anyone wants to come off mute, raise their hand, or ask something in the chat. And if not, then we'll pass it on to Dominique and we can ask Jonathan some questions later. Okay, I am going to get Dominique settled here and let's hear about the prevention work that you're doing. Oh, I can't hear you. Thanks for bearing with us, folks. Still can't hear anything. It was definitely working earlier. Let's.
Check.
There we go. Awesome.
Great. All right. Okay. So we can hear. All right. Thank you. My apologies for that. Thank you, Kimmy, and then thank you, Jonathan, for that great explanation of your experience. I am a prevention and education specialist at Camp Pendleton, and I've been there for it's a little over 3 years now. And so this is where my primary experience with the military comes from. I've learned a great deal about military culture. What Jonathan talks about, it is definitely a different culture. It's almost like another country because things run a lot differently than they do in the civilian population. So my job on a daily basis is I do domestic violence briefs around the base. The commanders will request briefs for their specific units. I am one of the prevention education specialists that will go out and we will talk about in our brief what domestic violence is. We will talk about what it's not. We will talk about the different laws and rules that apply to the Marines and sailors that are on base. There's a lot of things that we discuss that the majority of people don't know. We often do scenarios and skits for the Marines and sailors, and in those scenarios we'll have a scene where someone is stopping someone from leaving when they want to leave. And so then we will introduce the concept of false imprisonment, and the majority of people have no idea what that is. They have no idea what false imprisonment is. We'll talk about throwing the phone. They have no idea that these are potential felonies. And so we'll discuss these things. And the way we do these scenarios and skits brings up a lot of conversation, because with the culture that Jonathan's talking about, we have to debunk the theories and belief systems that a lot of the those in the military have. Because they will feel a certain way about something that is a crime, you know. And so in these conversations, it's an opportunity for us to help them to understand what the law states as opposed to what they feel in their culture. Because again, to Jonathan's point, the culture is very thick in violence. It's very thick. And some of these things are seen as, oh, that's nothing. You know, and especially in the Marine Corps, Marines are trained to kill. Marines are, that's, you know, if you sign up for Marine Corps, you're signing up for a specific branch of the, you know, the military. It's a little different. It was, you know, and in my younger day, I signed up, I played football throughout college. And so it's kind of the same thing. You have to have a certain mentality to go into this sport, you know, and it's the same thing with the Marine Corps. So you know, when Jonathan was talking about that, I completely see that the thought process that, you know, I am here to die for my brother or sister, you know, and that's an honor. You know, the irony of that is that, you know, and we talk about this in our groups. We talk about how it is an honor to die for your brother or sister, but has anyone taught you how to live for your brothers or sisters? Like, we need to teach you how to live. And so, and part of living is how you operate with your families and with your brothers and sisters. So we use these opportunities in the briefs to bring up very very deep conversations with these Marines. And it's important that they have the freedom to speak about their culture, about how they feel, without a sense of judgment, so that they can actually absorb the information that we're trying to give them. Sometimes it's we meet the brick walls. Sometimes, you know, we meet those who are saying, well, hey, I don't agree with this. And you know, and that's fine, because in those conversations, we let them know, hey, we're just presenting this information to you, just so you know. We'll talk about things like the Lautenberg Act. You know, the Lautenberg Act, if someone is convicted, military members convicted of a misdemeanor of domestic violence, you know, Lautenberg Act will kick in. This is what Jonathan was referring to, where that could be career ending, because you're no longer able to possess weapons after the Lautenberg Act kicks in. And so if you can't possess a weapon, in a lot of cases, you don't have the ability to serve in the military. So administrative separation is the next step for a lot of military members. Most of them don't know that. You know, they don't know that if you're involved in a 10-second altercation, that could be career ending. One of the other positions that other things that I do on base is I teach anger management / life skills in the brig. So I teach classes in the brig on base as well. So in the prison, for those that are not familiar with that. And so we have those individuals there who have crossed that line. And so once they cross that line, you know, they have to do their time in the brig. And then once they're released, more often than not, it's a dishonorable discharge. And so they have to recreate their lives there. So we teach classes there as well. And the other thing that I do is in addition to the briefs and teaching the class in the break, I teach anger management on base for those who come through family advocacy, because my program is housed in family advocacy, and they come through family advocacy because of some sort of incident that happened, and then their command sends them to the anger management classes. And for those who don't know, a lot of times when there's a domestic violence case, let's say it happens out in town for a military member, the district attorney will drop the case in a lot of cases. And then with the assumption that the military will handle this. So I have a lot of military members who will come into my anger management classes and they'll say, hey, my case was dropped, and they're thinking, hey, this is over. But the Marine Corps has another set of rules that in a court system, the IDC, Incident Determination Committee, which is their court system, that the military member has to go through. And it will be decided if they meet criteria or not. Meet criteria, guilty, not guilty. Just think of it in those terms. So the commanders, once someone has met criteria or they think something has happened, they will send them to my classes. And so the anger management classes that we teach, we also teach stress management as well. We do skits in the base theater. We try to find a lot of different creative ways to reach them. The typical death by PowerPoint it doesn't work. I'm sure Jonathan can attest to sitting in classes and where it's just people are just, it's just death by PowerPoint. So we've gotten really creative with how we operate. We do a skit called Relationship Wars, and this is where we're actually acting out scenarios that lead to domestic violence. So it's scenarios, hey, you're cheating on me, who's texting your phone? People are just upset because, you know, there's stress going on. And so we're acting these out, these scenarios out to the audience. And then once the scene is over, then we have a discussion about, hey, were there any crimes committed in this scenario? What happened? Why did this happen? So it's a great opportunity for them to see what domestic violence looks like, because, you know, it's, again, we've been trying to figure out different ways to reach them. And so that's been something that has been very, very helpful. And the last part of this, last thing that I do on base is I teach a class, which is an orientation for those who have caused harm, those who have been convicted, if you will, of domestic violence. They're sentenced to 22 weeks of, I'm sorry, as part of their recovery, they're sentenced to 22 weeks of recovery classes. That would be equivalent to the 52 weeks domestic violence classes in the civilian population. So on base at Camp Pendleton and many other installations, it's 22 weeks. And so what I do in those classes is I do an orientation. For anyone that does not know, I am a former offender myself. In my past life in the early 2000s, I come from that myself. And so throughout the last 10, 15 years has been a journey of healing for myself, healing for those people around me, a lot of self-work, working on myself, going to get help from different places and different resources, and then actually not just changing myself, but changing others around me. So that is a background that I have. That's a unique perspective, and I use that unique perspective when I'm working with offenders. Because once an offender goes into a program, what everyone wants is accountability. Accountability is a process. It doesn't happen on demand because we want it. It's a process. These are people whose denial is very deep. The lack of awareness is very deep. So it takes a while for them to get to that place. I teach an orientation class. So before they start their 22 weeks, they come see me for my orientation class. I help speed up that process of accountability. So I share my story with them, and I let them know who I am. I let them know what the process was, and it helps them to understand that they actually do belong there. Because most individuals that are causing harm feel as though they're not doing anything wrong, specifically because of what Jonathan talked about. The culture says I'm not doing anything wrong. My belief system says I'm not doing anything wrong. So I will help them to understand that, hey, this is not an okay behavior. Let me share my story with you. Let me share you the losses that I've incurred throughout my life because of that. So that's a class that actually helps speed up the process of accountability. So when they go start those 22 weeks, they're able to absorb the information. Now, without that, what ends up happening is that a lot of the offenders that go through class, it'll take them 10, 15 weeks for them to actually realize, oh my gosh, I do belong here. And then the class is already over. So what we wanted to do was speed up that process. And so in our class, in the class that I teach, I guide them through steps. There's 5 steps that we talk about. The first step is them becoming aware that there's an issue. Then the next step, I talk to them about seeking assistance. the resources that are available. We have to give them permission, because in the culture says you don't go get help. The culture says, hey, you man up, you take care of it yourself, handle your stuff. So we have to give them permission and let them know that it's okay to get the resources. Resources are always available, but we never address the blocks that people have personally in their belief systems to accessing those resources. So that's the next phase. We talk about it being okay to get help. And I talk to them all the time about, our suicide rates, the rates of domestic violence, and then talking about the thought process of trying to handle those things yourself. So we talk about that in the second part. The third part we talk about is the accountability piece. We talk to them about how accountability is actually a helpful thing to them, because it will help them to gain control over their lives. And then the fourth part, we talk about taking action. We talk about them actually, and I say this to them, I know you, most of you love your families. Sometimes you just don't know how. Sometimes your mechanism of love is a harmful one and you don't know that. And so let me help you understand that. And so we talk about taking action. Taking action means responding differently. It means not using abusive tactics. It means becoming aware of the power and control dynamics. It means becoming aware of the power and control wheel and all of the things that are on there. And then saying, am I using those techniques? Am I using those abusive behaviors? And so we have very frank conversations about that, and then what the results are if you are using those behaviors. I talk to them about my own personal experience. I tell them, hey, I was divorced because of my toxic behaviors. Like that's the end result, and so it's a very candid, very frank conversation, which they actually appreciate. So we talk about action, and then the last phase is actualization. I'm sure some of you are familiar with self-actualization, which is becoming who the person that you want to be. So we talk about the incidents, we talk about what happened, talk about action, and we talk about where you want to be as a human being, as a person, as a man. How do you want to move throughout the rest of your career in the Marine Corps, or if you're moving beyond the Marine Corps, what do you want to do? So that orientation class, that's something that I've created specifically for the environment, because I saw the struggles that were happening with those who were just coming in. Again, the denial, the cognitive dissonance, it's very, very thick in those environments, because these are what I call hyper-masculine environments. You have the same amount of violence in the military in general, and the police, the law enforcement. So you have very high rates of domestic violence in these two areas. And so anytime you have that, you have to cater your treatment to that environment. And so we have to, and that's something that we're doing there. So, and throughout these last years, I've learned a great deal about military culture. Like I said, just listening to Jonathan, at 100%, I agree with everything that he was saying. It is 100% true. That culture translates to belief systems, and those belief systems that this is not a problem, it permeates throughout the military. And so it takes special work to work against that culture, because you have to work against it in a delicate manner without disrespecting it. And so and that's something, as an outsider, I'm an outsider. I'm not part of the Marines, but so we walk a fine line with that, without disrespecting the culture, but still making them understand that, hey, something is wrong here, and then we need to change it. So I'm sure there's something I'm leaving out on base, but in a nutshell, that's what I do on base. And outside of base, I have my own business as a speaker trainer. And I use my own personal experience, my professional background in sociology, psychology, and just my work experience in the human services field for the last 30 years. I put all that together to try to service those military members in the best way possible. So I'm sure I'm leaving out something, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. I'm 100% open to that.
Thank you so much, Dominique. That was wonderful as well. Yes, if anyone has any questions for Dominique before we kind of bring Jonathan back to do a larger Q&A, feel free to unmute, raise your hand, or put something in the chat. Okay, I'm not seeing anything yet, so let's bring us all back. So now opening it up to questions that anyone might have for both Jonathan, Dominique, or if there's one that's kind of more directed to one of our presenters. But again, feel free to unmute, put something in the chat, or raise your hand. I certainly can get us started. The question that I'm going to start with, and I'll put it in the chat as well, are what are some of the opportunities for doing culturally specific work with military families? So someone who's watching this presentation today can take away and go, okay, I want to start working with military families. What do I think some of those opportunities are?
Well, on base, and let's say in family advocacy in general, our team consists of clinical therapists who are working with the military members. They are a huge part of what we do. We have victim advocates, we have case managers, and then we have our prevention and education specialists, which is myself. So us all together as a team, we work together. When that case comes in, all of us are going to see these clients at some point. I'll see them in the classes that their commands are asking them to do. The therapists are going to see them on a regular basis, or they're going to do a threat assessment in the beginning. They're going to find out, okay, what is the assessment? And then they'll be in close contact with the command. Because again, for those that don't know, the command is the one that makes a decision as far as what needs to happen. Any type of discipline, we don't do that. No one else. That's the command. The commander will say, hey, look, this is what you got to do. If it's okay, you're out of the Marine Corps, the commanders, the COs, XOs are going to make that decision. It's not us. We simply will make recommendations to them and say, hey, look, this is what we see. Based on the assessment, and then the commander will make the determination as far as what needs to happen. And so the victim advocates, of course, we know that role. It's different than, let's say, a victim advocate who is not in the military. The victim advocates here, sometimes a victim may say, hey, I don't want any more part of this. I want to go back home to Oklahoma. And so the victim advocate will help facilitate that to where they can send this spouse home if that's what they're choosing. Or as I'm sure we all know, they will if I want to stay in my home, they'll come up with a safety plan to stay in the home as well. The case managers work closely with the commands. They're in contact with the commands and letting them know, hey, this is what the recommendations are. This is what we're doing. They're pretty much the contacts with the command. So those are the 4 areas for family advocacy. There are other areas. There are embedded specialists, who work directly with specific units. I believe, Kimmy, that's what you were talking about. So being embedded. So just a few that are in family advocacy for the Marine Corps.
Thank you. And go ahead, Jonathan.
I think that over the past few years, the DV field has really started doing a lot of culturally specific work now, which is not really with the military, but with other communities. And I would say that you'll probably see any of the same benefits that you see doing that work going into the military families, communities. You'll start to recognize like where they are in their mindsets and how to change it, and how to essentially you'll be heard more, and hopefully at least change the mind of a few people and say, hey, this is conflicting to you personally. This is how it's conflicting to the military, and you're having these strict belief systems that were reinforced by you by people in the military. However, how is beating your partner, those leadership traits that you have sworn to serve? How is beating your partner honorable or courageous or commitment? And that is the military model for the Marine Corps. So you're following these strict violence beliefs, but you're not following all the beliefs of like of what you already swore to kind of do and serve and how you protect. So that's just an example. You can really kind of understand how to explain how to learn their language. Like Dominic said, you have to kind of meet them where they're at, and through that experience, you can actually kind of open people's eyes and tell them, hey, this is actually wrong. Yes, I can go and serve, like you said, I can die for my brothers, but I can also live for them, for my family. If that makes sense.
It does. Thank you. Any questions from the audience? I definitely have more myself, but I want to leave space for if anyone who's watching today has any questions for Dominique or Jonathan. I also know it's a lot to absorb if this is newer information for you, or if you're trying to synthesize, okay, well, what do I see in my community? Go ahead, Candace.
Hi, my name is Candace. I work for Aki's Asian Women's Home, and we actually just completed our 40-hour training, which provides a certificate to be a DV counselor here, in California. And one of the topics that we talked about were better intervention programs, and it was a very, very small segment. I wish we could dive deeper into that. But like Dominique was mentioning, in the similar program in the military, they are working on holding perpetrators or, people who harm accountable, from what it sounded like. What are some of the responses that you've got from that, Dominique? Like, how does that resonate with the people who take your program? What are they left with, and what do they say after they've completed such a program?
Thank you for that question, Candace. The great majority of those causing harm will go in kicking and screaming because, again, there's a level of denial. In order to be someone that causes harm, you have to have denial. Denial is almost mandatory. And so the accountability, one thing that I explain to them, and I explain it to everyone else too that I speak to, accountability is not enough. I can sit in jail. Was I accountable? Yeah, I was accountable. Did I change? That's the question. And so that's where I'm after. I'm after the change part. I'm not the jail. Jail is one piece. So the accountability needs to add another layer, and that's healing. So we never think of those who cause harm as broken individuals who they have to heal. These people, there's a lot of things that the military will bring. There's PTSD. There's TBI, traumatic brain injuries, that a lot of people will come in, not excusing any of the behavior, but they're coming in with extra things that, let's say, the civilian population doesn't have to worry about. The trauma, Jonathan talks about going to Iraq and going on tour. There are things that happen to you when you're deployed that the civilian population never has to deal with. So they're dealing with a lot of different traumas. And so we have to add the healing piece to this. Accountability plus healing equals change. And so to answer your question, Candace, almost everyone comes in kicking and screaming. You have a few who have a level of awareness, but they come in kicking and screaming. Once they realize what this is and realize the formula, and we try to give them a formula that, listen, if you don't like this and you don't want this, then you have to change how you're operating. Once we're able to give that to them in a palatable, digestible way, not to where it's not non-judgmental, we're not telling them you're monsters, you're horrible. We're just saying, okay, look, you've made some bad choices. Let's help you figure this out. Once they understand that we are here to help them, their tune changes. Then they want to learn it. I've had several guys go through the program, and after they're like, hey, can I come back and help? I want to teach other guys. I want to help other, because the light comes on. So how we operate with those who cause harm is very important. If we can address them, then that's one less victim coming through the door. So that's where my focus is. I consider myself a victim advocate by way of offenders. And so again, I'm going to help the victim advocate world by making sure that we get these offenders to actually change. And we've accepted this notion that accountability is jail. And it's not. It's not in any way, shape, or form, because what are victims doing? If someone gets a 5-year sentence, what are they doing 4 years, 7 months in? They are nervous. They're calling the district attorney. They're calling, hey, this person is getting out. They're still worried because they haven't changed. And so we focus on, okay, making sure they understand you have to be held accountable. But we're actually in that accountability, there's going to be a healing level to this too. So they do kick and scream, but once they find out what this is, they actually like it. And then they say, oh my gosh, I did not know this. And they want to keep coming. Rarely do we have people who will come in and they go through the program and they're like, oh, this is stupid. But it's really the way it's designed and how we operate them is designed to help them maximize the level of healing that they need. And then once they heal, once they're able to change, if they still have, a partnership with their spouse, they can help affect that circumstance to a certain degree. Or if not, they're moving on to another relationship, then they can do that in a healthier manner. But yeah, in the beginning, it's always the same. I'm not shocked. People will see, some of the newer therapists or people will come in and see the stain that the people have for, this process. I hate this. This is stupid. And I'm like, don't worry about it. Just give them a few weeks. They'll be all right. They'll be fine. So, but as someone that works with offenders, you have to understand that. You have to know that. So you don't get taken aback by, it's almost like when you deal with a teenager. I always tell people when you work with teenagers or you have teenagers, you don't take them at face value a lot of times when they say, well, I don't care. Okay. Yeah, I know you do. You just can't show it. But I'm not going to take that as face value. I'm going to keep working with you. I'm going to keep loving on you until you get to, a place where you're okay expressing it. So it's a different skill. It's not for everyone. It's not for everyone. It's definitely something different. But yeah, they do come in kicking and screaming. But I'm not shocked at all.
Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that was one of the big questions that we asked at the beginning. Do you believe that someone can change? A lot of our survivors will sometimes call our hotline and ask if their partners can change. And we say that with accountability, but also the big piece that you mentioned, healing, right? Because hurt people hurt people. And so they're hurt too. There's some things they have to unlearn. There's trauma there. So it's definitely like a system, right? And so thank you. I appreciate that response. And I'm glad that y'all are doing the work that you're doing. It definitely takes a special kind of human being and a different level of patience, right? So thank you for the work that you do, and thanks for sharing that with me. So now I can implement that into our training and share that piece too.
You're welcome. One last thing I'll say on that too is that, there is a formula. When we're asking this question, can people change? And there are certain factors that we have to take into account. Sometimes there's deeper seated issues that are happening. If you're talking about someone who is a narcissist, who's diagnosed narcissist, someone who is a sociopath, okay, so then that's a different level. But if we're talking about the average Joe, yes, they can change. It's up to us to provide the right formula, because we put the onus on them to change when they don't even want to change. They don't even see a problem. So if you're going to bring them into this process, you have to give them a formula and have them buy in. One of the things that I use is motivation. Motivation, especially for us men, is everything. If we're motivated to do something, think about the things we do. We do some of the stupidest things being motivated. Anybody seen that show Jackass? Like, we're motivated. We do some, and if you look at some of the things we do, and on the other extreme, look at, how we're motivated. Jonathan talks about the video that they watch. It's a motivational video. When you're motivated, you will do anything. And so now if we take and tap into their motivation, why is this important for you to change? And so we show them their family. Oh, do you understand your kids are experiencing this? Do you know what they're experiencing when they watch you and mom fight? Do you know what's happening? And so that brings a whole different world to them. So tapping into their motivation, making it personal. Making it personal is very important. Most of them think, well, I just got to do this because the court said, or my command. No. This is about you and your family. So we put that on them. So there is a certain formula that you have to use that we have not been using in this industry when it comes to working with offenders. That's why people have the attitude that they can't change, because the formula is wrong and no one's adjusted the formula. So when I look at it, and I look at it from personal experience, like, oh, well, I could see this very clearly. So that's just one other thing I wanted to add to that. But again, thank you for that question, Candace. Appreciate that.
Jonathan, is there anything you would like to add to that? And then we have another question in the chat for after that.
I'm sorry, you kind of broke off a little bit. What was the question again?
Oh, I was first just asking if there was anything that you wanted to add to that. And then if not, I have another question in the chat that I'm going to ask.
Okay, yeah, I mean, there's definitely, people can change, right? I can be an example of that. I currently work for a domestic violence agency as an educator. I lead youth programs on people stopping their violence, right? But that's not the type of person I was when I was in the Marine Corps. It was very much, my job was combat. So it was like every little thing was considered good training. So violence was considered good training, right? When we got promoted, the reward was violence. When you misbehaved, the reward was violence. So there was a lot of forms of violence, right? But I can really tell you how my experience in the military and the leadership and that I was receiving then is totally completely different than the one I am now. And in the feminist domestic violence organization, where I see a lot of support and love for my job, and I have growth a lot, right? Now, in our organization, I see a question that says, what curricula do you use to recommend for effective intervention with people who harm? And what we use is the mankind curriculum and the womankind curriculum, right? Essentially, for those calls where people are like, hey, I want my partner to stop being abusive. Data shows that those who actually complete the entire curriculum there's a pretty good chance that they're not going to be abusers again, right? And I've seen some vets participate through that and also complete the program, right? So there is a lot of different benefits to it, just like the way that we're institutionalized to think that way in the military. We can also challenge those behaviors in that same way as well. And like Dominic was saying, take a personal close look, not just at the fact that you are being a military person, but also you as a human. Like, is this who you want to be? Is this how you're going to be? I said it before as well, like some of the things that you're doing right now are actually violating some of the things that you swore to protect and do as a military personnel, right? As well. So you're kind of violating your current belief systems as well, because you say, hey, one of the Marine Corps motto is weakness is leaving the body. Weakness is pain is leaving the body. Pain is weakness leaving the body, right? But it can also be like, hey, you can use those models. You can use that those things that we kind of talk to kind of hype what we would want to do to say, hey, by doing this behavior, you are going against those things that you should believe, right? Like I said earlier, it's not an honor to abuse your partner in the same way that it's an honor if you actually pass away fighting for your partner in the form of team versus in your house team, right? Those type of things. Another thing is that when you're in the military, like you said, you tend to learn to train to kill. And that book that I mentioned earlier has a really great like analysis, in-depth analysis of it. But you kind of learn to dehumanize yourself, because you know, if you're gonna go to war, you're not thinking that, hey, this person is just another kid trying to defend this country or something like that. You're thinking this person is the enemy and I have to kill this man because it's him or me. And so there's really gotta like Dominic said, you gotta challenge that belief, but you also gotta heal. You gotta remember, hey, I'm also human, right? I'm not just part of this organization. I am a human, I am an individual, and I can challenge those beliefs in that way.
Thank you so much for that. I did get a couple more questions in the chat. So I'm glad folks are starting to ask things. I think, reading this and hearing everything you're saying, I feel like we're also really tapping into restorative justice a lot here. And so with that, so this is kind of a two-part question it looks like I got. How do you stray away from the narrative of teaching survivors to avoid harm and instead teach people not to harm others? Do you believe that the language we use with survivors and perpetrators of violence is essential to the overall cause of ending violence?
I think that's a very important, I don't know that, I still think that there is a place for teaching survivors to avoid harm. But I think we need to bolster the conversation about teaching other people not to harm. There's a conversation of us teaching, young girls to be safe, but not teaching young boys to be, places of safety, and to make sure that you are a safe person and to not harm other people. So and the reason I say that the conversation, for survivors, me personally, just thinking that still should be there, because there are individuals who are still out there who will harm, and so I think we still should keep that going, but we have to start developing the conversations and having the spaces to where we talk about, hey, it's not okay to harm. Let's have a do no harm policy. Let's have a do no harm policy that we all carry around. Let's try to not harm each other people. Let's have those conversations. I remember as a young boy growing up, just in the culture in general, not military specific, there was never a conversation about, not harming. I didn't have it. It was the more dominant you were, the better. That's what the culture taught me. I played football, and culture is very similar to, Jonathan talks about in the Marine. We're very similar. And so that mentality, it was a violent sport, and it was, the mentality of do harm you got medals for doing harm, you got awards. I got a scholarship for doing harm to other people. But there was never a conversation, a substance, a real deep conversation about not doing harm to other people. And then in my case, I grew up in a home where violence was normal as well. So everywhere I looked, it was there. But, to counter that, to this, I'm not sure who asked this, but to that question, it's very important to create spaces to have these conversations about, let's not do the harm. Let's be better people. I show the Gillette commercial in some of my classes. If you all are not familiar, Google the Gillette commercial for men. And, so a lot of men went nuts when they saw this. They was like, oh my gosh, they're trying to soften us as men. But that is where the conversation starts. And there are people on the internet burning their razors, and and it was, the commercial was literally just saying, hey fellas, let's do better as men. That's all it was saying, was just, let's do better. Let's not harm other people. And it was a visceral response that happened. And so we talk about that in our classes. So I'm creating spaces for that. I'm sure we all in some way, shape, or form are doing that. But I think that has to be a priority. But in addition to still teaching survivors how to make sure that they, stay safe.
Thank you. What about you, Jonathan?
I think it's definitely important for people to kind of recognize what harm is to them as well. As Dominic said, it's definitely more, I don't want to say it's more important to teach people who are abusers to not be abusive. I don't want to, and again, labels are not very helpful, as I've seen in chat, right? Because I think that's where you have to come from, a place of healing. Be like, hey, why are you doing this? What is causing you to do this? And instead of saying you're a bad person, you're this. And I think that's the reaction that a lot of men got when they saw the Gillette commercial, because they're like, hey, you're a bad person. If someone's like, you're a rapist, you're an abuser, you're the bad guy, they immediately reject that, and that's why a lot of men reject the term toxic masculinity, I believe, because we use that term toxic, right? And I think it means that I think a lot of men think that they mean that, hey, you're a toxic person just because you're a guy. I don't I don't think that's the correct response. I think that we really got to change that narrative, because it's like, hey, that's not the case. I say we're not, as men, just masculine. You know, there's a whole spectrum, right? We are human beings. We're not just a man. We are human, and we have other feelings. We just learn to kind of disregard them and say, hey, instead of saying sad, you say I'm pissed off, right? You should be like, hey, yeah, you're sad, and it's okay to say that you are sad. There's nothing wrong with that, right? But because of that, we tend to focus on that very end part of that spectrum of toxicity. And like, yeah, there is that portion of there, that's a small percentage, where if you believe that you don't ask for help, you can commit suicide. But that's not who you are. You're not just that little portion. You're this whole spectrum, and you can be like the healthy person that you want to be. Because everybody, I want to say, I think most people want to be happy. They don't want to be in a domestic violence case or a situation where they're always angry and blowing up. It's very overwhelming and tiring and stressful. Uh,
Thank you so much for that as well. And I just want to highlight in the chat, as you mentioned, Stephanie already said labels are never helpful, because rarely does someone identify with the label we may use: victim, offender, abuser, etc. And then Vanessa pointed out two things. Vanessa said, I think the language we use is very important. And coming from a trauma-informed perspective, I feel calling people abusers and or victims can cause harm in terms of how they look at themselves. And Vanessa also said, at the VA, we focus on referring to individuals as people who use and or experience violence. Many times people associate their behaviors as who they are as an individual, and that is not usually the case. That also speaks to reinforcing a sense of shame, which both of you talked about, to accept that they more often than not have redemptive qualities. I think it speaks to the idea that people can change if they are ready and motivated to change their behaviors. I think that's a beautiful summary of kind of what we've been talking about. So with that, we have about 10 minutes left. And so if anyone does have any final questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But I'm going to ask, what's one last thought you want to leave folks with, or hope that folks take away from today? And whoever wants to start first can.
I will say I think it's important for all of us to just learn more about military culture. I mean, just to learn about it and learn about as much as we can, because as with any issue that we are facing, the more we know about it, the more we know how to address it. So before I started at the position that I'm in now, I knew very, very little about Marine Corps culture, only what I think someone said, what you saw on TV, and then once I got in there and I started with the face-to-face interaction, shaking hands, spending time, talking with these Marine Corps and Navy military personnel, a lot of that changed. It changed, and so I was able to gain a level of insight that was extremely helpful to me. I think this piece is very important with the military. It's as Kimmy talked about, it's an underrepresented area. Like, we just often think, oh, well, no, we don't have to worry about that. And I think that we should include this more into our normal discussions of solutions for domestic violence. But again, we do have to learn the culture and be respectful of the culture while addressing it at the same time. So just in a nutshell, for me, it's just, please, as much as you can. Yeah, I'm sure Jonathan is willing to help. Kimmy's willing to help. I'm willing to help whoever needs, information on learning this. But I think learning about the culture is extremely, extremely important when it comes to being able to address this issue.
So for me, I think the data is clear. it shows that domestic violence is not only happening in the military community, it is happening at much higher rates than the civilian community. They yet are not getting the resources, the prevention, the intervention as much as the civilian communities. And again, that's oftentimes dismissed because we assume that the military is going to handle it. The military is an expert at being the military. We are the preventionists, we are the domestic violence field who are experts at being the domestic violence prevention, right? So we should definitely be a part of that community in the same way that we have been involved in the schools, politics, jail system, and other things as well. So I think that is my takeaway from today. And yeah.
Thank you both so much. I think both of those thoughts really, as you said, encapsulated why we're here today, the real goal of what today was, and really appreciate the audience questions, really appreciate both of you sharing your experiences and your wisdom and kind of being put on the spot with some of that too. I put my email in the chat if anyone wants to connect with me after. If you two are comfortable putting yours as well, that's great. If not, that's totally fine. As we wrap up today, again, thank you, Jonathan and Dominique. Thank you to our ASL interpreters, as always, for being here and creating that accessibility. I will have this in the resource library and uploaded ideally tomorrow. If it doesn't happen tomorrow, it'll be early next week. And so folks can refer back to those resources and links that we talked about, or watch again and share with those who weren't able to attend, but you think this would be really beneficial for. I'm also just going to make a small announcement that tomorrow this was our Prevention Peer Network webinar, and tomorrow we have our Prevention Peer Network call, and our call will be on the prevention assessment findings. Some of you took the prevention assessment for your organization back in the fall, I believe, and it was to really give us an idea of what's going on in prevention around the state and help us as the coalition figure out gaps and what the needs are, et cetera. So if you want to hear about that, I also popped that link below. Anything else that anyone wants to share or ask? If not, I can let everyone go and be on their way, but just really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation today, because this has been one that I wanted to get started for a while here.
Mm-hmm. And thank you, Kimmy, for having this conversation. I do really appreciate that. I remember when you reached out, this was a great idea, and I think more light needs to be shed on this. Thank you, Jonathan. Appreciate meeting you on here. And thank you for our ASL interpreters as well. I really appreciate everyone that was a part of this today.
So do I. I want to thank everybody as well for joining us. Thank you, Kimmy, and thank you, Dominic, for having this conversation. It's really great to hear from you, because I get to hear the other side of the prevention in the military that I didn't get to experience while I was in. Thank you to the interpreters as well.
We will hang on for another moment as folks exit or stick around. And I will stop the recording.